And of course we had the controversy this week over the DUP's veto on the same-sex marriage debate. Well, joining me now to discuss the issue are the Green MLA Stephen Agnew and Dr Alex Schwartz from Queen's University, who's followed closely the use and the alleged misuse of the mechanism. You're both very welcome to the programme. Stephen Agnew, first of all, you signed, of course, a petition of concern to block welfare reform. What was your justification for doing that?
I think I'd had a simple decision to make. I had stood on a platform of defending public services. It was number 2 in my election leaflet. Here's a key public service, the delivery of social security, which was under threat, the risk of cutting the incomes of the poorest in our society. And I had the choice to make a stand against that. I'd sought to amend the bill, I'd sought to improve it, I'd sought to work with other parties. Those amendments were Petition of Concern. The final bill was cut and paste what the Tory government implemented in Great Britain. It's been disastrous, it's damaged the poor,
right.
and I chose to sign a Petition of Concern against them.
So you satisfied yourself that in that circumstances, as far as you were concerned, the ends justified the means? I think that's right, and I think there is a question about whether or not we should have the Petition of Concern. It's something that the Green Party opposed in the Good Friday Agreement, in our Good Friday Agreement submission back in '98, because in effect it relies on designating as unionist, nationalist and enshrining sectarianism within our system. So we thought it was the wrong method. So I do think it needs to be reformed. But you used it.
Well, that's where you have to play the game that you're in. Those are the rules of the game. And as I say, there was the situation where thousands of my constituents, thousands of people across Northern Ireland were going to be disadvantaged.
Right, but you could never criticise another politician for using the mechanism because you've used it yourself. You've also played the game.
There's the term use, there's the term misuse, and then there's abuse. Now, I used it to protect my constituents and those poor families across Northern Ireland. There's those who've used it, for example, to protect their own minister from criticism and censure of the Assembly. I sit in the Standards and Privileges Committee. We've recommended sanctions against a member who's been independently deemed to breach the Code of Conduct, and parties have said, no, we're going to block that. And I think that's abuse of the Petition of Concern.
Alex Schwartz, I suppose you could say, couldn't you, one person's use is another person's misuse or abuse?
Right. I think to understand what is an appropriate use and what is a misuse, you have to think about what the purpose of the procedure is in the first place, right? So there are two key elements of having a power-sharing democracy in a deeply divided society like we have. One is the power-sharing government, which we have in the executive, and the other is some kind of veto procedure so that the partners to power sharing can block decisions that affect their distinctive group interests. And that's why we have the Petition of Concern, is to protect the distinctive group interests of British Unionists and Irish nationalists. But the problem we have is that there's nothing built into that procedure to prevent it from being used for all kinds of decisions that have nothing to do with those interests.
So it can be used for party politics, really, which has nothing to do with protecting minority interests.
Absolutely, and that's the problem we face, and we've seen a huge increase in the frequency of the use of the Petition of Concern, as well as the kinds of issues that it's been used for.
So we see the big parties using them and then turning around and criticising the other parties for doing the same thing. So there is there not, a degree of double standards at work?
I wouldn't want to single any of the parties out, because actually all of the main parties have been guilty, so to speak, of this sort of quote-unquote misuse of the procedure. So the question then is, what do we do about it to try to fix the situation that we're in?
Yeah, well, let's come to you on that in a second, but do you think it needs to be fixed very quickly and can be fixed?
I think it needs to be fixed, and I think, in fact, the Assembly institutions need to be fixed. They're not working. I think that's clear. And I think there's been a number of bills, my own children's bill about better cooperation between government, but also...
Which wasn't blocked by a Petition of Concern.
Which wasn't blocked, thankfully. The opposition bill that John McAllister's bringing forward, which does seek to reform the Petition of Concern, and I think that proposal of moving away from the community designation and towards a weighted majority, requiring a number of parties to sign up to any petition, I think that can help better corporate decision making.
How could the system be made more effective and more accountable, Alex?
Well, there are several options that we might consider. One is to get rid of the cross-community voting altogether, but I think that we're not at a place yet in Northern Ireland where that's a wise, prudent thing to do. So the sort of thing I think might be a better idea to look at is to try to include additional rules that would limit the use of the procedure to certain kinds of issues. So we could devise rules which set up broad categories of the sorts of things that we think the procedure
for example,
ought to be used for. So I think one category would be matters to do with cultural identity, symbolism, flags, emblems, language, these sorts of things which have a very obvious unionist or nationalist dimension to them. Another category would be things to do with the legacy of the conflict and dealing with the past, which also would have a distinctive unionist or nationalist aspect to them. And so you could have that kind of built in so that the Speaker of the House, for example, the Speaker of the Assembly could accept or reject petitions of concern on the basis of those grounds, whether they fit within those categories or not. But
within those criteria, issues like welfare reform and same-sex marriage probably would fall outside the remit. Is that right?
So, I mean, there are clearly some issues that would definitely fall within those categories. There are definitely some issues which would clearly not fall within those categories, and there are some issues which are more controversial. And I think, so I don't want to take a stand about any of those particular views. I think some of them are questionable. I think the most recent one is questionable in terms of, is there a clear unionist, British unionist interest at stake in that decision over marriage equality? I'm not entirely sure that there is one.
And that's the challenge, Stephen Agnew, isn't it? That sort of nebulous bit in the middle between the big constitutional issues and bread and butter politics.
I think, and we do open up and we create another problem, we solve one and create another problem. I think for as long as we enshrine within our assembly institutions a divided model of politics, unionism versus nationalism, then we just perpetuate the divisions that exist within our society. We're coming up to 20 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. I think we have to move away from the two communities language. We're a diverse Northern Ireland now. We're supposed to be dealing with economic issues, education, health, environment, regardless of whether or not you're nationalist or unionist. We should be moving away from that language and addressing those sort of so-called bread and butter issues on their merits, rather than which side of the community you're perceived to be.
Just before I take a final word from Alex, I mean, given what you've heard from the Secretary of State tonight, and given the fact that these talks are still continuing up at Stormont over the next couple of days, are you optimistic that a deal is being cooked up?
I think the words that I've been picking up is that something will be agreed. I don't know what that looks like, but I think the clear situation is that the DUP is desperate not to go into an election, so they're not in a position of power. I think they'll have to agree to something.
And Alex, just a final one for you. Reform of the Petitions of Concern is apparently being discussed. It was ahead of agreement in the Stormont House Agreement. We know it's being discussed in the current process. What are the chances of Sinn Féin and the DUP actually agreeing to reform something that they have both used to their benefit in the last few years?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, but the fact that all the parties have to some extent abused it means that they all stand to gain something by fixing the problem. So they could decide that it's in the best interest of the people of Northern Ireland to try to put a lid on this and de-escalate this and actually make the system work better for delivering the goods for people here. I think that would be something that they could all hopefully unite around.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see how it pans out. Thanks both very much indeed. Very interesting to hear your thoughts. Let's hear what tonight's commentators make of what we've been discussing. Alex Kane and Paul McFadden are with me tonight.